chapter. Average supply and the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. He starts off the chapter by giving you two theories of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Right? You can have the short-run aggregate supply curve upward sloping either because of inflexible prices or because of inflexible wages. So he gives you the sticky price model with menu costs, which we'll take up when we get to New Keynesian economics. And he gives you the imperfect information model of Lucas, which you will get in the New Classical Economist. In the previous edition, he also had a sticky wage model, which actually is the original Keynesian and monetarist version. He omitted it from this edition of the text for reasons that I may be able to get into at the end of the period. But it doesn't matter which underlying explanation you use for the inflexibility of prices or wages, right? The greater the flexibility of prices and wages, the steeper the short-run aggregate supply curve. If wages and prices are fully flexible, you will only have a long-run aggregate supply curve. You will not have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. On page 388, Mankiw gives you an equation for the Phillips curve that is a Keynesian muddle. If you look at the, well, I'll put it up on the board. The equation he gives you is the rate of inflation, which he uses for pi, equals the expected rate of inflation minus beta times the difference between the actual rate of unemployment and the natural rate, plus a variable for probabilistic variable for supply shocks. So notice, if you just look at this equation casually, what do you get out of it? You get out of it that the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate determines the rate of inflation. And of course, the causation is the exact opposite, right? It is the rate of inflation relative to the expected rate of inflation that determines the deviation of unemployment from its natural rate. Now you can say, well, this is just an equation, you can think about the causation any way you want, but I've seen many Keynesian models that use the equation this way, and then all of a sudden they're starting thinking about unemployment being the independent variable and the rate of inflation being the dependent variable, which is not Friedman's theory. It doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. By the way, supply shocks are sometimes referred to as price shocks. They are always, even though Mankiw gets this wrong, they are always initially shocks to the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now you can add a story about what's happening to the short-run aggregate supply curve when the long-run aggregate supply curve is shifting inward. But remember that the only thing that causes a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve is a change in expectations about the price level or the rate of inflation. It's the only factor. On page 391, even though Mankiw has included in this text chapters on money that are pure monetarism. He can't help himself from somewhat backtracking from that by talking about demand pull inflation and cost push inflation as if they were symmetrical. Right? This actually relates to my answer to Sam's question. One of the dominant explanations for inflation during the Great Inflation was what was known as the wage price spiral. Labor unions drove up wages, that drove up prices, that caused labor unions to drive up wages. All right, that's your traditional cost push inflation. And unless it's accommodated by a change in the money supply, it's limited. So to imply that demand, in other words, demand pull inflation is inflation driven by changes in the money supply. Cost push inflation is inflation driven by a supply side shock, which means that cost push inflation does never generate sustained inflation, right? It only generates a one-shot increase in the money supply. So to imply that they're symmetrical, I think, is misleading. Then we get into the different forms of expectations, rational versus adaptive expectations, that we will be taking up in more detail next week when we get to the new classical school. But one of the things I like about this chapter is if you rigidly hold, in other words, what happened after the Great Inflation of the 1970s was Volcker becomes chairman of the Federal Reserve. He's bought into monetarism enough to slam on the monetary brakes, and you get two back-to-back recessions, 1980 and 1982. So if you look at those recessions and you take a strong view of rational expectations, they shouldn't have happened. In other words, people knew that Volcker was going to reduce the rate of inflation, and therefore you shouldn't have had the recession. On the other hand, if you take an adaptive a strong view of adaptive expectations, those recessions should have been much more serious than they actually were. So the real world experience falls somewhere in between the two. He talks about competing explanations for European unemployment. We'll get to that later. And he introduces the concept of hysteresis, which is another New Keynesian concept. And the easiest way to understand hysteresis is it is a theory that suggests that even though we have this natural rate of unemployment towards which the economy gravitates over time, that severe shocks in either direction can actually affect the natural rate. So in other words, if you have like the current recession, that may raise the natural rate, although actually now the natural rate is way down low, and you have an expansion and it might lower the natural rate. So anybody have any questions on this chapter?
That was actually one of my questions that you just covered, but my question is, do we know the actual, for example, natural rate?
No, it has to be estimated.
Has to be estimated. Okay.
Yeah. So you usually have a range of estimates, and you may have noticed in the readings that last week Tobin in his interview, in the first part of the interview, says, "Oh, there's not much difference between the natural rate and the Keynesian non-accelerating inflation rate of inflation in the Nehru, and then later on he says there is a difference. Although when he talks about the difference, it has nothing to do with the idea that there is this long-run rate of unemployment towards which the economy gravitates. It is entirely, it has to do with how you explain it. So Mankiw defines it simply as the average long-run rate of unemployment. Friedman defined it as the equilibrium, the rate of unemployment you would have if the economy, if the labor market was in long-run equilibrium. Tobin doesn't like that definition. So it is the rate of unemployment that you have if the inflation rate is constant, not accelerating or decelerating. I don't think there's much to be gained by getting into those different ways of describing it.
Okay, because I just wanted to.
And remember, I described it as the amount of unemployment that is explained by microeconomic theory alone and doesn't require any macroeconomic models.
Yeah, I was just
which
wondering.
Is my preferred way of
because so we do know what the natural rate is, and we can see that there is
well, we can only estimate a natural rate. But the reason that there is this distinction between the natural rate and cyclical unemployment is because there is this belief that something is unusual about cyclical unemployment that can't be explained with regular microeconomics. That's why I think my way of defining the natural rate is actually the most illuminating. Now, we will see that when we get to real business cycle theory, they are essentially saying that the deviations in unemployment can be explained by microeconomics. So they're sort of implicitly rejecting the idea of a natural rate. So nobody has any other questions on that chapter?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
So I don't quite understand the explanation for the second explanation for the aggregate supply equations.
Which page?
Yeah, 383. So he talked about the
Oh, imperfect information model?
yeah.
Okay. I'll get into that. You'll read more about it next week in the chapter that in Snowden and Bain. So I'll get into it then. But basically, it's sort of a throwback to what I said was the pre-Keynesian neoclassical position. People would see a change in prices, and they couldn't figure out whether it represented a change in the price level or a change in relative prices. So if they think it's a change in relative prices, it's going to initially change their behavior and change the behavior of firms and workers until they realize that, oh, it's just a change in the price level. And then they go back to the long-run equilibrium.
Yeah. So, for example, the price, he has a higher wage, right? And so, why he motivate to work harder and produce more?
Oh, because we have an upward sloping demand curve, supply curve of labor, right? So here's our supply curve of labor. Here's our demand curve for labor. And if workers think real wages have risen, well, the only way they can rise is if the demand for labor goes up, well, the labor input's going to increase.
So is that possible? He think he has higher wage, so he decide to produce less.
Right. Yeah, thinks has a higher wage, so workers decide to work more.
Because he has a higher income, why he
Right.
so he think he has higher income, so he decided to work less. Is that
No, he
possible?
thinks he has a higher income, so he decides to work more.
So because I'm richer, so I decide to work less.
Okay. I think I talked about this before. On an individual basis, you can have a backward bending supply curve of labor because the substitution effect, right? The substitution effect is that as the real wage rises, the opportunity cost of leisure goes up, and therefore, if you only have the substitution effect, you're going to choose less leisure and more labor. But also, if your wage goes up, your income goes up, right? And therefore, the income effect might lead you to do less work because leisure is generally considered a normal good. So on the individual basis, we can't predict what somebody will do, but if we think about the entire economy and remember that the economy includes people who are not in the labor force, who can be drawn into the labor force by a higher real wage, it turns out that the general consensus is that the aggregate supply of labor is upward sloping. Maybe not because existing workers are working more, but you draw more workers into the labor force. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at some of the elements, some of the critical elements of Keynesian business cycle theory as they relate to the loanable funds market. Now, remember that Keynes blames the fall in aggregate demand on a fall in spending, right? A fall in autonomous expenditures, right? People are spending too little. They have a certain income, but they're spending less of it, which of course means logically that they have to be holding, on average, larger amounts of cash balances. They have to be accumulating money. Now, the idea that depressions and recessions resulted from too little spending is not original with Keynes. It was a popular theory around for a long time. It dates back to the mercantilist economists prior to Adam Smith, if you can call the mercantilist economists, which is dubious. And your neoclassical economists and your classical economists believed that underspending theories had been refuted by sophisticated economics because they violated Say's law, right? Only supply can create demand. Now, the underspending hypothesis historically has come in three versions, all right? The oldest version and the crudest version is the overproduction theory. This is the theory that was put forward by mercantilist economy. And basically, what this theory argued is that if our economy is experiencing economic growth, and that implies that the long-run aggregate supply curve is shifting outward, the economy's producing enough, people aren't going to buy everything, and therefore you're going to have a glut in the market, which was the term used for a recession. if aggregate demand doesn't grow with the growth of long-run aggregate supply. Now, this theory is not only crude in the sense of challenging the notion of scarcity, saying it's a bad thing for the economy to grow and be more productive and produce more goods and services, but it is empirically refuted by many periods of gentle, sustained, secular deflation and rapid economic growth in the 19th century. So it is true that in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was spreading from the UK to all sorts of other countries, and the world, most of your economies were on a commodity monetary standard, either a gold standard or a silver standard, which didn't totally constrain, but did constrain the growth of aggregate demand. You had secular deflation at the rate of about 2% a year. And as Friedman pointed out in one of his answers to the question, if you look at the growth during secular deflation and the growth during secular inflation, there's hardly any difference. So economists have never taken this hypothesis seriously. Unfortunately, it was taken seriously by politicians in the late 19th and early 20th century. It became the main justification for Western imperialism, right? Our economies are becoming super productive. We're producing this glut on the market. We need more markets, right? To absorb all of this excess capacity. Well, how do we get more markets? Well, we impose our rule over Africans and Asians, right? To get the markets, right? To solve this problem. So, although not ever playing a significant role in the history of economic thought, it unfortunately played a significant role in the history of imperialism. A more sophisticated hypothesis was the hypothesis of Malthus. And he essentially had an underconsumption view. So basically what he said is that, or what he implied, if we put it in the context of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and now we can introduce short-run pricing flexibility, that, remember, this is C plus I plus G. If this falls, right, aggregate demand will fall, and that can create a recession. Short-run disequilibrium, if we have inflexible prices or wages. The neoclassical economists generally rejected this version as well, because a second implication of Say's law is that you cannot have general underconsumption. People earn money to spend it, supply creates its own demand. If they spend less on one thing, they'll spend more on something else. Well, the obvious answer to that is, what about saving, right? Isn't that not spending? And here we get a critical component of the pre-Keynesian neoclassical view, which is that they believe that saving